So today we're going to be going over segregation in America, kind of 1890s to 1900-ish, that sort of time frame. We're going to be going over Jim Crow laws and some xenophobia. Reconstruction, just kind of a recap, a short little recap. Can anybody tell me what Reconstruction was, the Reconstruction era? Right after the Civil War, that kind of time. What was going on right after that? Yeah, that kind of stuff. What else? A little bit more. Think more along the lines of what's the big thing that happened? What was the Civil War fought for? Slavery, yeah. Slaves were kind of free, that kind of stuff too. So after the Civil War, this was the era of rebuilding, trying to put the country back together. Slaves were freed, so we're trying to figure out, kind of putting the pieces of our country back together after the Civil War, trying to make sure all the pieces and parts fit together. There's three main amendments. I put the first one up here for you, the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery. These are kind of key ones that kind of build up into this kind of era of discrimination. The 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to slaves. And the 15th, which gave the right to vote to all citizens, which would now be including freed slaves. Alright, and if I start going too fast, you guys can yell at me to slow me down or whatever. We're going to try and keep it moving though. Some of the 15th Amendment and voting right restrictions that ended up occurring during this time period. Basically after the slaves were given all these freedoms, especially in the South, there was a huge pushback by the whites. They kind of fought back against all these freedoms that were given to the newly freed slaves, especially with voting rights. The first one we see is the literary restrictions. Only men who could prove that they could read were allowed to vote at this time. This was obviously a big hindrance towards especially poor and blacks, because at the time they weren't allowed to read or write under, or most masters, white slave masters, didn't allow their slaves to learn to read or write. The poll tax, annual tax imposed that required a fee for people to vote. As far as the poll tax, who do you think this affected more? Who do you think was affected most by the poll tax? What's that?
People who couldn't afford it.
Yeah, the poor. Who else? There's a big group of people. The same with the literary restrictions. Poor and blacks. Poor and blacks couldn't afford the poll tax, mainly because most African Americans, they didn't really own a lot of land. They didn't have money saved up, that kind of stuff. The grandfather clause, though, kind of took this and turned it. Anyone who could not pay the fees or pass a literary test that was given at the time, they were actually allowed to vote if their father or their grandfather had voted before. So basically what this did was it took the literary restrictions and the poll tax and basically said if you're white, that doesn't matter because your father or your grandfather voted. So basically what the grandfather clause said was blacks can't vote. That's kind of what it did. And there you have, it effectively allowed the whites to bypass the restrictions automatically. Here we have some pictures of some early demonstrators against the voting restrictions, the poll tax, stuff like that. Yes?
Can you go back to like the first class?
Yeah. grandfather clause, that's actually something we still use today. A lot of times, when you're ordering things or stuff like that, if you already have it, they'll say you're grandfathered in. It's kind of like, if you've already done it, they change their policy, then you're allowed to remain under the old way, the old system. So that's kind of where that comes from. We still use that today. Are we good? Here's some pictures. Right here you see this guy, he's kind of got white face on. During the time, blackface was kind of a thing that, it was a satirical kind of making fun of, poking fun at black slaves. So here you see whiteface, which is kind of playing off of that. The Jim Crow laws, these were a set of racial discrimination laws in the South. The name Jim Crow, I'll show you the little song. During this time, one of the popular things for upper class white people to do would go to these minstrel shows, and they were basically, people would have blackface on and they'd make fun of slaves and the black culture at the time. I don't have the song to play, but you'll see the lyrics. It's, I don't know, it is what it is, I guess. And the big thing with the Jim Crow laws, though, is it established the separate but equal doctrine, which we'll talk about here in a second. No. And then here's the song on the left. On the right, this is kind of the picture of Jim Crow. The song on the left, you guys can see it's kind of written in the style of how blacks were portrayed to speak during this time. You see a lot of gals and he's just stuff like that. Very over-dramatized in their style of speech, that kind of stuff. I'll give you a second to read through it if you want. I'm not going to make anybody read it out loud or anything like that. But as you can see, it's like over the top almost.
It's just how they speak, so I would thought that
You think they still speak like that?
they did.
I don't know if I don't know, but nobody would write it like that anymore. No.
Like some people do.
All right. You don't have to write that down or anything. I just wanted to show you guys that kind of where it came from. Separate but equal. Now this is the doctrine that kind of came about from Jim Crow laws. Began with the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. Now this is a lot to write down. You just kind of want to hit the key points. You don't need to write everything word for word. But basically, there was a black man, Homer Plessy, and in actuality, he was only 1/8 black. He was pretty much a white man. But in the South, because he had that 1/8 black, he was considered a black man. So Homer Plessy, he boarded a white-only car. They kind of set it up because they wanted this kind of to happen. So they set it up. He boarded the white-only car and was shortly arrested for boarding the white-only car instead of riding the African-American car. The courts, they took it to the courts, and they took it to the Supreme Court, where they ruled that it was fine to have these separate cars as long as they were equal, which is kind of where you get the separate but equal. Eventually, it would be repealed by Brown v. Board of Education. Brown v. Board of Education, you'll go over a little bit later.